welcome back, everyone. I'm Clemente Beghi from the Center for South Asian Studies. We're now in our last session for today's workshop, and we have with us Darin Stockdill, and he'll be teaching us how to use all the material we've got today, all the information we've got today in the classroom. Darin is the Instructional and Program Design Coordinator for CEDAR, the Center for Educational Design, Evaluation and Research at the School of Education. In his role, he partners with educational organizations, teachers, U of M faculty, staff, and students to design innovative learning experiences and resources for educators and their students. His work is driven by his intersecting interest in social justice, adolescent and disciplinary literacies, design thinking, and inquiry-driven learning. Darin has worked in the field for over 25 years, and he has worked as a substance abuse and violence prevention specialist with youth, a classroom teacher, an educational researcher, a curriculum developer, and a teacher educator. He earned a doctorate here at the University of Michigan in 2011 in education studies with a focus on literacy, language, and culture. He researched adolescent and disciplinary literacy and was one of the first graduate students instructions in the Instructional Rounds project in teacher education. After completing his doctorate, Darin worked at Oakland School's Intermediate School District as a literacy and social studies consultant. And in 2015, he returned to U of M to work at CEDAR. He enjoys partnering with the National Resource Centers and here on campus. And this is a nice opportunity because it's always learning, there are always learning opportunities. So let's welcome him, and the stage is all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's great to be here on a Saturday afternoon. I'll try and keep this engaging for you. I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. Again, I'm happy to be here with you today and looking forward to the opportunity to talk a little bit about how do we take deep content like you've learned in today's sessions, connect it to concepts, and really use this idea of case study and concept development learning to transfer our own content knowledge into learning opportunities for our students. Now I just have to figure out how to get to the next slide. What has happened? Let's see if it allows me. There we go. Oops, and I bypassed one. So our driving question for the day is, how do we take deep content from today's session and from similar learning experiences and develop accessible, engaging learning opportunities for our students that are aligned to our curricula? And what I'll be sort of thinking out loud about is, what are the concepts or historical patterns that the historical journey of Mary illustrates that we can use to help shape instruction? So I'm going to talk through some instructional frameworks, some concept development ideas, share some resources that we've developed titled cleverly Something About Mary in line with the session today, and then just offer some final thoughts. So these aren't going to be new ideas to most of you, instructional frameworks to drive the process, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. But what we don't want when we're thinking about transferring our content knowledge into conceptual learning for students is we don't want the banking model of education as described by Paulo Freire, in which education is about depositing, the students are the depositories and the teachers the depositor, and it's really just about sort of knowledge transmission. That's not what we're hoping for, right? We would rather go into problem posing education, in which the teacher is no longer merely just the teacher, the one who teaches, but is learning in dialogue with students who are also becoming teachers. It's a joint responsibility for a learning process in which everyone grows. So people teach each other, mediated by the world, and we're treating students as critical co-investigators. This ties to the more sort of commonly referenced teacher-centered versus student-centered pedagogies, right? So teacher-centered is about assessment, where we're testing individual students to measure their knowledge. They learn to reproduce the knowledge. We as teachers, we're sort of the owners or controllers of the knowledge, and it's our job to transmit it. We'd rather shift this balance towards student-centered, in which case assessment is multidimensional. It's about supporting learning. Students are collaborating to solve problems and answer their own questions. Students are owning and constructing their learning and knowledge, and the teacher's there as a facilitator and a supporter. So the big ideas in this kind of learning, and again, I'm just trying to set the stage for where we're headed here, is that learning in this context is problem driven. It's not just driven by a series of topics that are coming out of a textbook. We're framing rich intellectual problems for students to engage in. It's inquiry based with real world applications. So it's connected to work and questions that people sort of outside of the classroom are grappling with. So it's teaching and learning that emphasize student thinking, knowledge construction, dialogue, connection to the world and lived experience, and collaboration and the development of a learning community. And there we go. So in that context, as we're trying to build that out, then we think about what does it look like to plan something like this? So this is one of my favorite quotes, especially if I'm talking to world history teachers. And I know some of you are world history teachers. By Grant Wiggins, the view that everything of importance can be thoughtfully learned by the 12th grade. Notice I did not say taught is a delusion. So right away, we want to recognize that when we cover things, this idea of coverage as education is not necessarily teaching it. There's no way we can teach everything that and have students learn everything that's important. So what we have to do is pick and choose case studies or examples that are high leverage and that have a lot of conceptual depth to them to help students learn how to think and build their own knowledge, right? So case studies are particular instances or examples of something that are used and or analyzed to illustrate an important principle, concept, or pattern. Case studies can demonstrate important concepts, patterns, or trends across time and space. So we want to be really selective and thinking carefully again about how are we going to illustrate broad patterns of history and culture through interesting, compelling case studies. So we could start with our content expectations. We look for core concepts, trends, or patterns that matter. And then we look for case studies or examples, or even non-examples that break that concept or pattern. Or the flip side, we could start with really interesting cases like Mary and what you learned about today. Identify the core concepts, trends, or patterns of significance to which that case connects. And then you look for the relevant content expectations. And we'll see an example of what that looks like later on. Having done that, let's say we're going to start with Mary and the phenomena, the historical and cultural phenomena that you learned about today, that is sort of Mary and the reinterpretation of Mary across time and space. We would want to develop a driving question or a problem statement, right, that then guides the inquiry in that case study. We'll draft our learning outcomes and ideas for our final product. How are students going to show, engage in some backward design, right? Then we develop our resource and our text set. We develop the lesson then that has scaffolded activities that meet students where they're at, but really challenge them to get into these texts. And then we revisit everything. And this is actually more circular than linear in planning. We want to be kind of going back and forth. Sometimes you might start in the middle actually with a really great set of resources, like you probably got in your sessions earlier today. Figure out what your students are going to work with and then kind of move both up and backwards in this process and really make it more circular. So what we're going to do now is think a little bit about Mary and what she might serve for a case study and delve into this idea of concept development. I'm going to, in a few minutes, send you into breakout rooms and we'll try a little activity. But if we think about the learning in which you guys engage today, and we think about concepts connected to the different versions of Mary across time and space, we get some really big, important, powerful concepts, right? We have belief systems underneath, if we think of almost as a categorical hierarchy of concepts, belief systems, religions, world religions, we get into syncretism, cultural diffusion. We could add more, but this is just a really good starting place. And later on, we'll delve a little bit more into syncretism as a core concept for this. And what we want to begin doing with students is we want to help them unpack these concepts, apply them to their lives and their own perceptions, but also use them as historical thinking devices and tools to consider culture and history over time. So if we think about what belief systems are, there are religions, there's spirituality, there's philosophy, and they're all kind of tied up with why are we here? How do I find meaning? What happens when we die, right? They're developed to help us answer these really big, important questions, but they do so in different ways. So before I'm going to define these things very explicitly for students and just say religion means this, spirituality is this, and philosophy is this, I might engage them with concept development activities, not just vocabulary teaching, but really giving these ideas the weight and the time that they deserve. So take a moment and just gloss over these, skim over these quotes. They're all kind of about purpose and what we're meant to be doing here in our time on this earth. But they're not all the same orientation in terms of belief systems. Some are religious and some are not. So what is it that makes some religious and what is it that makes some more philosophical? How do we differentiate religion and philosophy? So this is the kind of exercise when I talk about concept development as opposed to just defining concepts that I might engage students with. Before I tell them what scholars have already said, this is what philosophy means and this is what religion means, I might have them grapple with examples like this and try and figure out what is the difference between religion and philosophy. And you can get into some really heady conversations, obviously. So what we're going to try now is we're going to try a breakout room discussion, and I'll explain what you're going to do first. And this is, I'm sort of front loading the activity first before I break it down and kind of talk about what you're doing. And you're going to open up a document. Well, let me check the chat here. It's been placed into the chat. So if you open up the chat, you'll see there's a link to a discussion document. And hopefully if I did everything right, you'll actually be able to open it. And I understand that not everybody's is able to open a document. Some people are joining via phone, which makes that difficult. So if you're unable to open a document, hopefully you'll be in a group with somebody who can open it. And the person in the group, if you're with people who can't see the document, just quickly describe what you see there. It's really basic. What you have is a description of 5 different religions. And I want you to really skim over it and have a quick discussion. Are they world religions? Without having a definition or criteria set yet, are they world religions? Why? What characteristics would you identify that differentiate world religions from other religions? So that's what you're going to discuss. We'll give you somewhere around 5 to 7 minutes to talk about that. We'll send you into breakout rooms in a minute and just have that quick conversation and come back ready to share out some ideas in the chat about what you see. So again, if you're not able to open it, just think about how you would define, how you would differentiate religion versus world religion. All right, so let's get into breakout rooms. Hopefully everyone will be able to open the document. There we go. I was watching the numbers. Looks like most everybody's back. Great, thank you. I hope you had good discussions. I know you didn't have a lot of time, but you get the idea. So let's take a moment and just sort of process. There are some that are obviously always on the list of world religions, and we sort of take them for granted as world religions, but why? What makes them world religions? So based on your conversations, jump into the chat and just jot down some characteristics you talked about in your small groups that define world religions. Let's just hear from a few people in the chat. See what you talked about. Portability, can you take it with you? Absolutely. It's practice globally. So practice globally, I would have to say, what is that? You know, that's something we might break down and deconstruct with students, like how global? What do you mean by global? Number of people following. World religions need to be world in scope. So absolutely, wide geographic spread. How known is it? How long has it been practiced? So what we could do out of your list that you guys are coming up here is track the list of criteria. And if I was doing this with students, then what we would do is we would develop a list of these criteria, and then we would look at new examples and see if they fit or don't fit the criteria. We'd look for outliers. We might take Jainism, for example, which is on some lists of world religions, and on some lists it doesn't appear. It's one of the ones that sort of, again, depending on how you define it and the criteria you agree on, it either fits or it doesn't. So great ideas. Obviously there's a bunch of world history teachers, because you guys already probably do this, but you get the idea of, and we might use this as a lead into thinking about Mary, and then using Mary as this example of what do we, when we think about world religions, what spreads, what are the types of beliefs that spread across the world, and then how do they change and shift over time? So these are some of the characteristics that you already all identified. Appeals to and unites many different people. I might share this with students after they've developed their own list, and then we sort of compare our lists with each other. World religions are portable. They keep developing. They don't fade away. They're spread across different geographic regions. They're practiced by very large numbers of people. And we could get more specific and think about to what extent is there, you know, and play with different lists and create different lists. Then if we think about using Mary as a way to demonstrate, what does it even mean, like conceptually, or even from a practical, pragmatic sense, when something is a world religion? Mary as a religious figure is clearly global. This is from National Geographic, and this is based on sort of apparitions that have been recognized by the Catholic Church in the last, say, 500 years. So if you look a little bit more closely at this map, so this is a fascinating map that you could create a whole little mini unit around this, and trying to figure out how did this religious figure that emerged really in the Middle East travel and spread literally across the globe in 500 years to the point where she's become a figure of worship, veneration, questioning, sort of exploration, literally across every continent in the world, inhabited continent. So this idea that I'm talking about, just sort of place it pedagogically in a moment and give you, you'll have access to this PowerPoint. This is a great article if you haven't seen it before. Lauren Harris and Tammy Schreiner both studied with Bob Bain. Some of you have probably worked with them before if you've been engaged in some of this. And Bob Bain often does work around concept formation lessons. So if you were a U of M student, you've probably seen this before. But anyways, the concept development lesson is a really powerful process to teach. And you'd want to use it sort of at a strategic location where you're introducing a concept, and you really, again, want students to build that learning, to construct the learning, and move beyond definitions and really into deeper understanding. So you would start off, this might happen at the beginning of a unit, for example. It doesn't have to, but it's often a good place, where you select a concept that's foundational to your discipline, to the content, and to the problem you're going to use to frame instruction. So if you're teaching world history, you know, colonialism, imperialism, might be these nationalism, global patterns that are really important in the time period under study. And then what you do is you research how that concept is defined using multiple sources. You identify different conceptions, and you identify based on those what the core traits of the concept are, sort of the ingredients of the concept. Without these things, something doesn't fit into that. Civil war and revolution become really good ones. When is a conflict a civil war? When is it a revolution? What makes the difference? Then you would develop a set of 3 or 4 examples of that concept. These can be primary sources, primary source excerpts, secondary sources, images, audio, multimedia. The important thing is that your examples demonstrate these core criteria. Next, you name that concept for the students and you connect it to their content. You provide a purpose for exploring it, but this is the important part. You don't explain it or define it. You only name it. And then you can explore students' prior knowledge. What do they already know about the concept? You might use brainstorming activities to generate ideas. If you're teaching online, you might use a Jamboard and have students brainstorm. Then you provide them with the pre-selected examples of the concept. Again, you still haven't defined it or explained it, but their job is to work through these examples and note similarities among the examples and develop a list of potential critical attributes of the concept. The activity you just did is kind of further down the list. I jumped the gun and kind of gave you examples and non-examples in one list. What we would do with high school students is start them off, or middle school, start them off with a list of only examples that have the criteria, and their job is to identify through comparison and contrast the shared criteria and develop that list. Then there's a discussion more in depth than the one we had over chat, but with a similar purpose, in which they begin to voice the critical attributes that they've identified, and the teacher's recording them again on screen or on your board to try and reach a consensus. You're maybe crossing some things out, adding new ideas, and only then do you show them what other people have said, how other people have defined it. And they compare their criteria to the criteria that scholars have developed, and then try and discuss and resolve any conflicts among the different sets of key characteristics to create a final list of essential attributes, again, sort of ingredients of things that they fit into this conceptual category. And then they test more examples and non-examples. This is where your content comes in. So for nationalism, for instance, you might give them a different range of speeches. Developed a lesson around nationalism that had sort of international messages mixed up, from the, let's say, the 1950s, 1960s, where you had Cuba, or especially in the 60s, Cuba with a very international rhetoric in Fidel Castro's speeches, whereas in the United States, you had much more nationalist sort of rhetoric, unless we look at Kennedy. So there's you get these examples of when is somebody voicing sort of an internationalist message versus more of a nationalist message, and can students separate them out using these criteria? And then they offer up other examples or conjectures about that concept. By this time, and this can be done in a couple class periods depending on how you set it up, they have a much deeper understanding of the concept than they would have if they'd just been given a definition. So I'll pause there and just see if there's any questions about that before we jump into the materials that you have access to. And if you have a question, yes, Bob is slowly withdrawing from U of M, but he's still here. Any questions about concept development lessons or ideas? Great. So in the chat, way back up towards the top, if you're able to access the chat, you'll see a link, and you don't need to open this now, but just so you know that it's there. It says folder, and that gives you access to a folder where you'll find a lesson on Mary, a PowerPoint that goes with the lesson, today's PowerPoint, and also the discussion activity that you did. So there's 4 things in that Google folder. And we're going to talk through that. And Clement, thank you, has just posted that again in case you came in later. So I'm going to just briefly walk through some of the components of this lesson, and then we'll talk about it and share ideas that you have coming out of today's conversations. And so this lesson on Mary has some attributes of okay, all right. Okay, I will make sure I'm going to go through. I'll make sure the folder gets up there. I apologize. I must have put the wrong link in, but I'm going to carry on, and then I'll make sure that other link gets in there to the folder. So no worries. I'll get it up there in a minute. So this lesson that I'm going to walk through has some attributes of concept development lessons, but it's more sort of a broad case study and inquiry into the concept of syncretism. And again, it ties to the presentations that you had today. So what we were doing is thinking about the deep academic study of Mary and that you experienced earlier in the day. How do we get that accessible and sort of palatable for high school students? And what's the conceptual lens? And really thinking about this idea of religious syncretism through the global representations of Mary. So that's sort of the title of the lesson that you'll have access to, and Rima is going to make sure everybody gets access to it. So the driving questions of this lesson: how do different cultures and belief systems mix and merge when they come into contact? And why is the figure of Mary so widespread across the world? How does the study of different versions of Mary help us understand different cultures? There's supporting questions: what is religion? What are world religions? What is religious syncretism? How is Mary represented around the world, and what stays the same? How is she and how she is understood? And what does she symbolize across cultures? And what does that tell us about sort of universal values? And what does it tell us about different values? We want students to understand what syncretism is. We also want students to understand why the figure of Mary is so popular and so long lasting. And it's because of what she represents in terms of motherhood and virtue, and that she's flexible enough that people can sort of introduce their own values and events and experiences into different interpretations of Mary. So we start students off with just, again, this conversation around, well, what do we even mean by religion? And students are asked to stop and jot and just think about, when they see that word religion, what do they think of? What is religion? And then we have them do a quick image analysis to help push their thinking. So go ahead in the chat, just very quickly, what do you notice? What do these buildings have in common? Just in the way they look. Let's get a few ideas. Yep, pointing to the sky, pointy tops. They have spires. Yep, great vocabulary word. Spires reaching upward, upward reaching architecture. Some of the things we might also point out to student multiple levels is arched doorways, symbolism. There's and some that are more visible than others, but there are specific symbols. And so what we begin to distill through an examination of these images is that the religions, these religions in particular, share some common characteristics: a higher power, reaching upward towards that higher power, a symbol system and an iconography that speak to the beliefs of the religion. And we begin to help students go a little bit deeper in their understanding of that conceptually. Then we would take students, the lesson takes students through a series of different definitions. Again, oftentimes we'll only offer, because we're sort of crammed for time, we'll only offer up one or two definitions, but it's really good for students to consider different ways of framing a concept like religion, which is really complex and changes over time, and compare their own definition from the opening activity to this definition, and see if maybe they want to keep their definition, they want to change it, what would they add to it. This can help students move beyond this what's the right answer way of thinking, and begin to be more open to sort of developing conceptual knowledge, and that as we learn new things, we change how we think, and that's okay. Then the lesson goes on to define world religions and shares some of what we've already talked about in terms of world religions. And then what in this lesson, we took the time to build out this activity. Oh yeah, why are we even studying religion? Isn't this a public school or whatever kind of school it is? And we asked students to think about, why should we study religion through an academic lens? This becomes a really important exercise, particularly if we're going to use culturally responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogies, where it's very clear that we're studying religion as a cultural phenomena and not as something that we're preaching about or trying to get students to believe. So after students have surfaced some ideas about why studying religion, the lesson goes through and lays out some core ideas. The academic study of religion is not about getting followers or trying to make someone believe something new. It's about developing awareness, not acceptance, belief, or rejection. and recognizing that religion shapes how people interact with the world. So if we want to understand the world, it's something that we need to understand and take into account. And the students are basically told that in this lesson, they're going to learn about how cultures merge and change using a religious example. And the goal is to understand cultural change, not to argue that one religion is superior to another. And then this creates an opportunity to bring in other examples from different religions later on in the unit. And we introduce students again to this concept of syncretism now, starting off with one of our favorite examples of Halloween, of syncretism, which is Halloween. It's a great syncretic celebration. The actual lesson plan provides much more detail than this slide does, but our modern Halloween grew out of a Celtic festival called Samhain, which happened sort of midway between the end of summer and the beginning of winter. And it's a night when the world of the spirits and the world of the living are coming closer together. And so they would light fires and different things and put on disguises to scare off potentially bad spirits. When Catholicism spread through Ireland, Samhain was sort of co-opted and connected to All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. That was eventually brought to the United States through Irish immigration and sort of other European immigration. And then added to that mix is US popular culture of movies and superheroes. Certainly they weren't dressing up as superheroes back in Ireland back in the day. So our commercialized version of modern Halloween is very Americanized with our own popular culture mixed in. So it's a really interesting example of syncretism, as are most of our contemporary Christian holidays, at least, are oftentimes quite syncretic and have connections to different cultures in past societies. So students get introduced to trying to figure out what syncretism is by thinking about Halloween. Then they get a definition. It's the mixture or blending of different religious and cultural beliefs and practices. They read an article. Again, there are handouts and lesson materials that go along with this. I'm just kind of sharing components of the slides. Is anybody familiar with these? Let's just do some quick image analysis. What do we see? There's a progression. The image on the left and the image on the right come together in the image in the center. So a bunch of world history people. What do you see? What's happening here? What is this? How is this syncretism? What's being syncretized? What's being merged? So the guy over here on the left-hand side is wearing a toga. Yeah, robes and standing are merged with, yep. So we've yep. Got male images, so we've got a very Greco-Roman thing going on over here on the left. On the right, we have a traditional version of Buddha. In the center, we end up with Greco-Buddhism, which was a phenomena of Greek, Hellenic-informed Buddhism, in which representations of the Buddha are standing and in a toga, which is not traditional Buddha, right? Not traditional. So Greco-Buddhism or Hellenic Buddhism became a phenomena through Alexander the Great and through the merging in Central Asia of Asian cultures and Greek and Hellenic culture, again through the imperialism of Alexander. So it's a really interesting example. Students read an article about that. There's some map work that they do, and they're again exposed. It's another opportunity to consider imperialism, colonialism, and sort of merging how cultures come together through both trade and war, and merge their characteristics and their belief systems and create something new. So students are going through that. And then they get introduced to the figure of Mary as another example of syncretism, and some more image analysis. And these are just fascinating images. Maybe you saw some of them earlier in the day. The image on the left is from Rwanda. That's Our Lady of Kibeho. The image in the center is from, I believe, Bolivia, from the Andes. And the image on the right is more of a South Asian. I think that's Our Lady of Elanaki. Could be mistaken, but that's each one of these represents different versions of and apparitions of Mary and different historical patterns and trends and cultural mixes. So what we want students to notice is what stays the same, what changes, and what preconceptions they have about where these images might come from. And this is kind of how they start off thinking about Mary. They do a background reading based on adapted from a National Geographic article. And they encounter these quotes, which are sort of crucial ideas in sort of understanding the power that Mary holds across time and space. There's something about suffering and sacrifice. There's something about maternal love. And because there's a lot left unsaid about Mary, Mary can be adapted and merged to reflect different cultural values. So those are quotes from the National Geographic article that students are asked to consider and think about. And then there's a whole article there. And then they engage in case study readings in a jigsaw activity in which they learn about Mary in Islam with origins in the Middle East. They look at Mary in Latin America. This is sort of historically framed and geographically framed. They look at Mexico and they look at Bolivia. They look at Mary in South Asia with a focus on India and Pakistan. Southeast Asia, most of it's about Mary in the Philippines, a little bit on Indonesia, and then in Africa with interpretations of Mary in Rwanda in the more modern times. So through Mary, they're exposed to geography and sort of cultural history across the world and across really a fairly broad swath of time. This is a jigsaw activity. So this is a lot of content, right? Each one of these is a two-page, roughly a two-page article with an image. And so the idea is that to condense the time and to make it more manageable for teachers who want to try this lesson, it's jigsaw. So each group, students are working in groups of 4. They become an expert in their particular case study and their particular example, and they take notes about how or why Mary became popular. They identify what's unique or important, and then they have to analyze what belief systems are being merged. How is this an example of syncretism? Then they do some sharing, and then they go through some more image analysis. There's a lot of great imagery of Mary, and it would be a missed opportunity to not take advantage. So I'll show you some of the images, and then we'll have a conversation about other questions or ideas related to teaching this content. But we want students, again, with image analysis, paying particular attention to changes in clothing, skin color, and representation of race and sort of ethnicity, pose, colors, and also setting in the background, and what else is in the picture, and who else is in the picture, if anybody else is in it. So these are images of Mary in Islam connected to the Quran. And I'm sure you learned earlier today, but Mary is featured heavily in the Quran, which many people don't know. So you can see there's the symbolism, and there's some imagery around, there's a child, and sort of there's some sort of flaming, almost like a flaming headpiece in the 2 pictures on the right. There's particular symbolic meanings to that students might not pick up on, but the clothing, the background information, there's a lot happening in these pictures that differentiate it from other versions of Mary. This is Mary in South Asia, across Pakistan, versions of Mary that exist in Pakistan and India. Mary is actually revered, although worshipped isn't necessarily the right word, but respected and honored by many people of the Hindu faith in different ways. So it's not just, she's more than just a Christian figure, which makes her of particular interest and cultural significance. So here we have, sort of more almost like royal imagery in some ways, less of a simple Mary. Here we have Latin America. You see La Virgen de Guadalupe to the left, Pachamama, sort of a version of Mary that gets merged with indigenous notions of Mother Earth and the sort of through the figure of Pachamama in the Andes. I believe on the right is the Black Madonna. And here we have versions of Our Lady of Kibeho from Rwanda, who is a vision that appeared to young women predicting the Rwandan genocide in the early, the vision appeared in the early 1980s and predicted the genocide of the 90s. So then students they do some synthesis work across these different examples of Mary, and they're asked to think about why she's depicted differently in different regions, and what do these images tell us about the cultures of the places that these images are from? What do the local cultures and traditions add to sort of the universal Mary, and how do they change the universal Mary? And in what ways does syncretism appear in the images? And then there's an extension activity and an idea for students doing their own research projects on syncretism, in their own examples of syncretism in their own cultures and in their own lives. So what we want students walking away with this is that the different depictions of Mary across time and space illustrate diffusion in world religions and syncretism in some really interesting ways. Also colonialism. Mary was definitely spread through colonialism. That's one of the key mechanisms. So it's another opportunity. We didn't take that angle, but that's another angle that could certainly be taken. And by examining multiple case studies and comparing them, students develop a deeper understanding of syncretism as an ongoing cultural process. So I'll pause for a moment. I'm gonna, let me just add some final thoughts, and then I'll stop screen sharing, and we'll just see if there's any questions or comments. So the broad idea is that when we're thinking about how do we really get students into these, again, this deeper content sometimes than we're used to getting them into, it's really about engaging them with dynamic problems and interesting case studies that illuminate core concepts. And so we use that concept development process, like what are the criteria? What is syncretism? Let's look at some examples and figure out, is it the same as cultural fusion? Is it different? How is it connected to cultural diffusion? And we begin getting students thinking again conceptually and getting into that deeper learning using the examples instead of just trying to remember names and dates. And so we use multiple examples, and non-examples are also very helpful of a concept. And we develop this deeper understanding or more nuanced understanding of concepts that way. And of course, it takes time, and there's trade-offs. It would mean you would have less time to cover something else. But the argument is that that depth of understanding is worth the trade-off. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and we'll just see if open up the chat here. And feel free to share if you have an idea of how you want to teach about Mary or use some of these ideas, or how you already do, or if there's a resource you want to share, or if you have a question, pop it into the chat, or, we've got a few minutes left. You can unmute and share an idea or question.
Thank you, Darin. I think people must be thinking, so we'll give them a minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have a suggestion or a comment, Darin?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So ideas of virtue, innocence, purity, motherhood, sort of the values and yeah, absolutely. What Mary represents. You could begin to think about that. And think about how notions of motherhood, what is sort of universal, but certainly there are differences in notions of motherhood and parenting and virtue across the world. Yeah, so for final projects, a really interesting place to look is music, of course. So many young people are fascinated by music and listen to a lot of music, and music at its core is usually very syncretic. So having students unpack some of the music that they listen to and understanding the syncretic roots of their music is really interesting. Curating resources. That's a great question, David. Thank you. So I should give a shout out to Colin Roberts, who is a graduate student at U of M, who played a key role in developing this lesson. And what Colin and I found in the process, we were sort of in our initial research on Mary to develop the lesson, we found there was sort of two, and you guys probably find this yourselves, there's really kind of, when you do something like this, there's two sets of resources. You find more journalistic type of resources and more scholarly ones. And so what we ended up having to do, and why this work can be difficult, is we had to adapt sources and then oftentimes create our own. Or there's tourism. So for something like Mary, you do find sort of you have religious tourism and tourism articles, journalistic articles, and then scholarly articles. And the scholarly ones are oftentimes kind of out of reach for students. So we adapted them and rewrote our own articles, which can be difficult if you're teaching a full load. You oftentimes don't have time to do that. But the idea is not to overdo it. You want enough information in a document. So like National Geographic is great if you, depending on the reading level of your students and their age level. There's copyright issues, but we won't get into that. It takes time, and so I wish I had an easy answer for resource sets. But that's one of the reasons, like, why the NRC works with me, and we produce these lessons so that you have resources, because it takes a lot of time. Any other questions?
You have a couple of comments, it looks like, Darin, from Tim, and from Theo has a question for you. Yes, how does Mary shape values in different parts of the world, and how does it interface as syncretism?
Yeah, that's interesting. So how that's a sort of more complex notion. It's bidirectional, right? So it's not just that Mary, the figure of Mary doesn't just get shifted. She plays a role in shifting cultures in regions. Absolutely. So, I mean, you could take the example, tied Mary as a colonial figure and delve into, for instance, the debate or sort of the different storylines around La Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico, where we have Mary as an indigenous as appearing to an indigenous person, but was it his idea? Was this something, there's a lot of evidence, and many scholars believe that was a tool of Spanish colonialism to sort of usurp an indigenous belief system and to work towards conversion. And so Mary was used to impose beliefs in that sense, but has been reinterpreted and now is core to Mexican identity in a really national and indigenous way. So it's really complex, and sort of the level of complexity you get at with different high school populations can vary. But yeah, it's deep. I mean, when you really start trying to disentangle, just using that example, La Virgen de Guadalupe, and was she imposed? Yeah, she probably was, but she was retaken and redefined, and now serves a very different purpose than what the Spaniards may have intended. So it's really interesting how time and culture shift and interact.
Any other comments or questions? Darin, you began to say something.
I was just going to say, so Rima will share out the folder with you later on, and that folder will have today's PowerPoint, the lesson, the slideshow that goes. They're in PDF format, but you should be able to get lots of ideas from them, and please feel free to use them. My email address is at the end of the presentation, the slide presentation, which is also in the folder. So if you have questions or comments, or you use the lesson and want to give me some feedback on it, let me know how it went, please get in touch.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Darin, for your time, for your expertise, and for these wonderful resources. Please join me, rather, in thanking Darin, everyone. It's been a true pleasure. And as he said, I'll be sending out the resources. We also have the link to the recording, which we are preparing, and we will send that out to everyone. A lot of people have expressed interest. This does conclude the activities of our workshop, Biblical Women Across Abrahamic Religions. Thank you for joining us today. The workshop collaboration was funded by Title VI grants from the US Department of Education, awarded to the following centers: the Center for South Asian Studies, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of Michigan. Please visit our websites, join our listservs, and sign up for future offerings in professional development. And thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us. Have a lovely, lovely rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.